A forgotten 1885 research file sits in a Virginia warehouse. Inside its yellowed pages are detailed family trees of a lost American village, a place where the distinction between those who could hear and those who were deaf simply did not exist. We are told the history of America was built on separation, limitations, and institutions. But these records suggest an entirely different Old World heritage. Here, an entire society communicated through a silent, shared language for 200 years without missing a beat. This was not a small anomaly. This was a thriving, fully integrated system that directly contradicted the growing educational and government control structures of the era. Yet, the famous man who mapped this extraordinary settlement took his concrete evidence and buried it. One copy mysteriously burned. Another was sacrificed to archival bowels. The last quietly disappeared into a warehouse for 93 years. Their unique way of life was meticulously removed from our history. So what exactly did Alexander Graham Bell find on that island? And why was it so dangerous that it had to be erased? You have to ask yourself why a community that figured out perfect harmony was abruptly dismantled. On December 2, 1885, Alexander Graham Bell boarded a steamer from New Bedford to Vineyard Haven. The weather was grim, characterized by miles of abandoned cottages set against a howling storm. But Bell was not there to tinker with the telephone. He was already immensely wealthy from founding the Bell Telephone Company nearly a decade earlier. He came to this isolated American island for what he considered his real life's purpose. To understand the true scale of what he found, you must look at how history is deliberately falsified. Truth seekers constantly investigate Tartaria and the missing 1890 census. They search for physical anomalies like the suppressed 124-year bulb, the dismantled hydraulic power grid, or evidence of underground cities. Many look for the last living giants or giant children to prove our timeline was hijacked. But the greatest old world story in America was not built of stone or forgotten technology. It was a secret, self-sustaining society that existed quietly, long before modern financial systems took over, back when America had no banks as we understand them today. The timeline of this hidden old world heritage begins in 1694. A carpenter named Jonathan Lambert brought his family from Kent, England, specifically from a region called the Weald. His wife could hear perfectly, but 2 of their 7 children could not. Lambert carried with him a regional sign language, an older method of communication that likely already existed in Kent. By 1710, migration to the island had virtually stopped. The community became what geneticists refer to as endogamous. People married their neighbors. The genetic trait concentrated, and then something highly unexpected happened. The hearing children learned to sign too. This was not a deaf community surrounded by a hearing world that merely tolerated them. This was an erased reality, where the distinction barely registered. Deaf individuals held normal, vital jobs in fishing, farming, and carpentry. They participated fully in town meetings, in church, and in daily commerce. The statistics from this era are staggering, yet they rarely appear in mainstream textbooks. In 1854, when the deaf population peaked, 1 in every 155 islanders was deaf. That is already remarkable when you consider the national average was exactly 1 in 5,730. But that is not the only inconsistency. In the specific town of Chilmark, the number climbed to 1 in 25. And this is where the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. In a localized section of Chilmark called Squibnocket, an astonishing 1 in 4 residents could not hear. 25% of an entire village, deaf from birth, for generation after generation. If mainstream history dictates that people with differences must be separated and institutionalized, then why does this physical evidence exist? The hearing people did not isolate them. They did not build separate towering medical asylums. Everyone simply learned a shared visual language. It was a perfect, functioning societal loop that required no outside intervention. This unique communication method, now called Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, was used by almost everyone on the island. And when that language later merged with others at the American School for the Deaf, which opened in Hartford, Connecticut in 1817, it helped form what we now call American Sign Language. One of the largest community languages in the country has its hidden roots right here in this small island village. But independent systems are deeply threatening to those who wish to standardize society. When Bell arrived, he interviewed a family in Chilmark with 6 deaf members. He drew detailed family trees. He mapped the genealogy of the island with the cold, calculating precision of a scientist tracking a viral outbreak. He saw a pattern, and he was absolutely terrified. Then the records stop. No explanation follows. What Bell did next with this missing information changes the entire picture, because he was about to ensure that this undeniable proof of human harmony would quietly disappear from the world entirely. He did something I still do not fully understand. He made exactly 3 copies of his groundbreaking research, and then the erasure began. The first copy burned when his assistant's house caught fire. The second was, in his own words, sacrificed to the archival bowels of the State Historical Society. The third vanished into a Virginia warehouse where it would sit completely untouched for 93 years. He never published his raw data from Martha's Vineyard, but that is not the only inconsistency. What he did publish in 1884 was a paper titled Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race. In it, he called their integration a great calamity to the world. He advocated for repressive measures, not overt laws, but the quiet elimination of sign language from schools and the systematic dismantling of their culture in the name of integration. This kind of system-wide reset is not an isolated event. It mirrors other historical anomalies where the truth quietly disappears after this point. Think of how the year 1855 saw Chicago raised on mechanical jacks, or how 1863 saw the sudden implementation of centralized banks overriding local control. We see the same pattern when 1900 saw priceless Smithsonian artifacts hidden away in vaults, or when the year 536 saw the world go completely dark under a mysterious cloud, a deliberate restructuring of reality. And this is where it becomes even more unusual. 4 years before Bell even arrived on the island, a massive shift was engineered. In 1880, a conference was held in Milan, Italy. It was the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf. 256 delegates from around the world gathered to decide the future, yet only 4 of those delegates were deaf. The outcome was decided before the votes were cast. Proponents of oralism took control, and sign language was strictly banned in schools. Then the records stop. No explanation follows. What happened next was a rapid system override. Deaf teachers were fired across Europe and America. Children were aggressively punished for signing. Their hands were slapped with heavy rulers. They were forced to wear thick mittens. In some schools, children literally had their hands tied together to stop them from communicating. Imagine a child whose only natural language is their hands, and the authorities respond by binding them. This brutal resolution was not formally apologized for until the year 2010, and it was not fully renounced until 2025, because the pattern does not stop there. The island's perfect society was already being diluted. The American School for the Deaf had opened in Hartford in 1817, drawing children away who later returned with spouses whose traits had different genetic causes. Tourism brought new residents who did not carry the heritage. By the early 20th century, the rates had fallen dramatically. It remained a buried ghost story until 1978. A 26-year-old graduate student named Nora Ellen Gross was driving through Chilmark with a local historian named Gail Huntington. He casually mentioned that the owner of one house had been born deaf, then another, then another. The numbers simply did not add up. She started digging and finally uncovered Bell's buried data. We see this exact suppression cycle time and time again. It is identical to the 1929 Bells destroyed to erase frequency technology, or the heavily censored 1953 Last Witness accounts of suppressed ancient architecture. The evidence is always meticulously scrubbed. Katie West was the absolute last person in the hereditary line. She passed away in 1952. Her house in Chilmark still stands, but it is now the town library. When researchers arrived in the 1980s to study the unique Martha's Vineyard sign language, they found only a few elderly residents who could remember the signs. The language itself was effectively extinct. The last native signer was gone forever. And that leads to something even more unusual. Because what happens next changes the entire picture. The data was collected, then buried, while policies were implemented that systematically destroyed what made the community work. By the time anyone thought to look back, the people who actually knew how the old world functioned were dead. What if Alexander Graham Bell found a community where his entire philosophy was simply wrong? What if Martha's Vineyard proved that the barrier was never deafness itself, but the unwillingness of the system to allow an independent, self-sustaining language to exist? I cannot prove that. I do not have access to what he actually found in those missing family trees. The copies were burned, buried, and hidden away for 93 years, but the physical evidence remains. Katie West's house still stands. The old stone walls of Chilmark still mark the exact boundaries of farms where deaf and hearing people worked side by side for 200 years without a single barrier. Yet, the shared visual language is completely gone, and the man who studied them most carefully made absolutely certain that what he found would never see the light of day. Some patterns only become visible when it is too late to do anything about them, so I leave you with this question. If they could completely erase a thriving 200-year-old society from our collective memory within a single generation, what other parts of our human story have been quietly removed? Tell me what you think is hidden in those missing records down in the comments below, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it.